The dead do not argue. That was something I learned on my first day as a council observer, sitting in a cold briefing room on a station so far from Earth that the sun was just another dim star. The instructor, a tall Varathi with gray skin and 4 thin fingers, told us that the galaxy runs on silence. Species that accept their place, he said, survive. Species that argue about their place create problems. He never finished explaining what happens to species that create problems. I figured it out later on my own. My name is Sarah Voss. I am 34 years old. I have not slept in a proper bed in 6 years. I have not tasted real coffee in 4. I have not seen Earth in 10. I used to be a navigator for the United Nations Space Command. I had a rank, a uniform, a locker with a photograph of my mother taped to the inside of the door. Now I have a stolen crew tag from a Valyrian salvage company, a jacket with 3 hidden pockets, and a very detailed mental map of every emergency exit on every class of council vessel. I gave up the locker. I kept the photograph. It lives inside my left boot, folded twice, worn soft at the creases, from the number of times I have unfolded and refolded it when I thought no one was watching. The ship I was standing on when everything changed was called the Ironclad Wake. She was a mid-range salvage hauler, mostly Keth-built, which meant the corridors smelled faintly of engine coolant and something organic that no one could quite identify. She had a crew of 9, 7 Keth, 1 Varathi, and me. The Keth had hired me as a navigation contractor because I was cheap, because I did not ask questions, and because, as the captain, a wide, flat-faced Keth named Oru had once told me, humans made very good navigators. You plot routes the way your species does everything, Oru said once. Like you have nothing to lose. He meant it as a compliment. I chose to take it as one. I was sitting at the navigation console, 3 hours into a routine drift correction, when the council broadcast came through. It was not supposed to come to us at all. Council navigational updates were encrypted and routed to registered vessels only, and the Ironclad Wake was not registered for council frequency access. But 6 months ago I had quietly installed a signal fork into the ship's receiver array, a thin piece of hardware no bigger than my thumb, that copied every transmission passing within 200,000 kilometers and stored it in a private partition. I told myself I did it out of habit. I told myself it was professional caution. The truth was simpler than that. I did it because I was looking for something, and I had been looking for a very long time. The broadcast was routine in its tone. A calm, synthetic voice reading coordinates, updating navigational charts for council-registered pilots, new hazard zones near the Velith corridor, a revised drift advisory around the Mira cluster, standard procedural language, the kind that puts you to sleep after the first 30 seconds. And then, a deletion notice. In council navigational language, a deletion notice means that a set of coordinates is being officially removed from the standard chart. Dead stars, collapsed relay beacons, abandoned colony zones, these all get deletion notices. They are unremarkable. I had heard hundreds. This one was different. The coordinates were in a part of space I knew by heart. The star type matched. The orbital notations, even in their abbreviated council format, matched the planet's position relative to its sun. My hands went still on the console. My throat went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the recycled air. They had removed Earth from the navigational charts. Not the system, not the region. Earth. One planet. One specific, small, blue-green world, catalogued for centuries in every navigational database across the known galaxy, removed as if it had never existed. The coordinates were blank. The entry was gone. Where there had been a name, there was now a gap in the numbering sequence, a gap so small that most automated systems would never catch it, that most pilots would scroll past without a second thought. I sat very still for a long moment. I am not a person who panics. I stopped being a person who panics around the time Earth went dark, because panic is a luxury that requires a future you believe in. But my hands were cold, and the photograph in my boot felt suddenly very heavy. They had not just blockaded us. They had not just quarantined us, which was the word the council used in their official statements, pronounced with the kind of careful neutrality that meant something much worse was being hidden underneath it. They had erased us. They had looked at a species, looked at a planet, and decided it was easier to pretend neither had ever been there than to explain what they had done to it. I pulled up the archive partition on my console, and cross-referenced the deletion notice with the historical chart records I had been collecting. The original Earth entry had been created 412 years ago, when the first Council survey ship had passed through our solar system and logged the third planet as inhabited. I had a copy of that original entry. It was 6 lines long. It listed our atmospheric composition, our approximate population at the time, our technological development stage. At the bottom, in the notation field, some long-dead Council cartographer had written, "Inhabitants show signs of territorial aggression and advanced communication. Recommend monitoring." I had always found that note darkly funny. We had been flagged as a problem before we even knew the problem existed. Now the entry was gone. Not archived, not marked as historical. Gone. I saved the deletion record into my private partition, closed the console window, and sat quietly for a moment. Oru was at the other end of the bridge, arguing with the cargo manifest. The 2 Keth technicians behind me were running diagnostics on the secondary drive system. No one was watching me. I thought about what to do next. I thought about it for almost 3 minutes, which was longer than I usually spent on decisions, because this decision mattered more than most. Then the cargo bay alarm went off. It was not a large alarm. A soft 2-tone chime, the kind the ship used for routine cargo status updates. But when I pulled up the bay camera feed on my side panel, what I saw was not routine. One of the cargo containers in Bay 3 had cracked open along its seal. Not broken. Cracked open carefully, which meant the seal had been released from the inside. The containers in Bay 3 were supposed to hold salvaged relay components from the wreck site we had cleared 2 days ago. Relay components do not open themselves from the inside. Inside the container, curled on a bed of packing material, was a child. She looked about 8 years old. She was human. She was wearing a gray jumpsuit with a Council supply tag on the collar, the kind of tag used for non-citizen goods in transit. Cargo tags. They put a cargo tag on a human child. My stomach turned over. I had heard rumors about the collection trade. Every human who survived in Council space had heard the rumors. After the quarantine decree, when Earth was sealed off and humans outside the system were suddenly stateless, suddenly without legal standing in any Council jurisdiction, some people had found a market for us. Not a large market, not an organized one, but there were collectors among the outer species, beings with enough wealth to acquire things that were officially prohibited, officially gone, officially erased. Humans were rare now. That made us interesting. That made us valuable to exactly the kind of people who should never be allowed near anything valuable. I stood up from my console without making a sound. The Keth technicians were still running diagnostics. Oru was still arguing with the cargo manifest, which I now understood was because the manifest had been falsified. I crossed the bridge quietly, took the corridor at a measured walk so I would not draw attention, and went down to the cargo level. There were 2 of them waiting near the container. They were not Keth. They were Durathi, stocky and pale-skinned, dressed in unmarked dark suits that were just a little too neat for a working salvage crew. They were standing with the easy confidence of people who believed they were the most dangerous thing in the room. It is a confidence I have encountered many times. It is almost always wrong. The child was sitting up in the container now, looking at the 2 Durathi with the large, quiet eyes of someone who had learned not to show fear, because fear got you nowhere. She had dark hair. She had a bruise along her left cheek that was 3 or 4 days old. She was not crying. I remember thinking, even in that moment, that she was braver than she should have had to be. One of the Durathi noticed me. He said something in his own language, fast and dismissive, and waved a hand in my direction. The gesture meant, "Get out." It meant, "This is not your business." It meant, "You are a nobody on a salvage ship, and we are the kind of people who do not have to explain ourselves to nobodies." I walked closer. "What is she tagged as?" I asked. My voice was calm. This is something I am good at, keeping my voice calm. The other Durathi looked at me properly for the first time. He was reading my contractor tag, which said I was a Valurian navigation specialist named Etta Morsh, because that was the name on the stolen tag. He said, in passable common tongue, that this was a private cargo matter, and I should return to my station. "She is a child," I said. "She has a bruise on her face. I am going to ask again, and I would like an answer this time. What is she tagged as?" He told me then. He used the Council classification code. It was the code for non-citizen biological specimens, live transport. The code meant that in the eyes of the Council's legal system, in the eyes of every jurisdiction where that code was recognized, the girl in the container with the bruise on her face was not a person. She was cargo. I have thought many times about the moment that followed. I have thought about whether I acted too quickly, whether I should have been more careful, whether a smarter version of me would have found a less direct solution. Every time, I reached the same conclusion. No, there was no smarter version of that moment. There was only what happened. It was quick. It was quiet. I made sure of both. The Keth crew did not hear anything from the cargo level. When it was over, the girl was still sitting in the open container, watching me. She had not made a sound. "What's your name?" I asked. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Lily." "How long have you been in there, Lily?" She thought about it. "Since before it got dark," she said. "There was a window on the other ship. I counted 3 times when it got dark." 3 days. She had been in that container for 3 days. I crouched down in front of her. "I am going to take you out of there," I said. "And then I am going to find you something to eat. And then we are going to figure out where to go next. Does that sound all right?" She nodded. Then she said, very quietly, "Are you human?" "Yes," I said. She looked at me with those large, careful eyes. "I thought humans were gone," she said. Something moved in my chest. Something old and sharp and tired. "Not yet," I said. "We are still here." She let me help her out of the container. She was light. She was too light. I wrapped my jacket around her shoulders and walked her toward the crew quarters, and I thought about deletion notices and blank coordinates and a galaxy that had decided we did not exist anymore. We existed. We were still here. I had just needed the last 20 minutes to remember exactly how angry that made me. When I got Lily settled in an empty bunk with a ration pack and a cup of heated water, I went back to my console. I reopened the signal partition. I looked at the deletion notice one more time. They had erased Earth from the maps. They had decided, in their clean bureaucratic language and their careful procedural silence, that the easiest way to handle humanity was to pretend humanity was not there, to make us invisible, to make us not exist on paper, and trust that the paper version of reality would eventually become the real one. I thought about Lily in the bunk, eating a ration pack with both hands because she had not eaten in 3 days. I thought about Earth, still in its coordinates whether the Council listed them or not, a planet full of people who had not agreed to be erased. I saved 3 copies of the deletion notice to 3 separate hidden drives. I began composing a narrow-band transmission, the kind that travels slow but travels quiet, the kind that does not show up on standard Council scanner sweeps. There were people I needed to contact. Not many, but enough. The Council had made a mistake. Not the one they thought they had made. Whatever procedural error or security lapse had put those 2 Dorothi on a ship I was navigating. They had made a much older mistake, one that species make when they look at something dangerous and decide that ignoring it is the same as making it safe. You cannot erase people by removing their name from a list. You cannot make a species disappear by pretending the coordinates are blank. You can try. Many things have tried. The galaxy is full of the quiet graves of things that tried to make humanity disappear, and learned, in the moment it was too late to be a useful lesson, exactly what kind of species they had decided to pick a fight with. I sent the transmission. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the stars through the navigation window, 1,000 points of light crossing the dark, and I found the way you find a familiar street after years away, not by looking for it, but by recognizing it without meaning to, the dim, distant warmth of Earth's sun. They had removed us from the map. We did not need the map. We had never needed the map. I pulled up the ironclad Wake's next route on my console, began calculating a new course, one that took us nowhere near the original destination, and I thought about what came next. Whatever it was going to be interesting. The station Velroth smelled like bureaucracy. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say about a smell, but if you have ever spent time in Council-administered space, you would understand immediately. It was the smell of recycled air pushed through ventilation systems that had not been properly cleaned in decades, mixed with the particular chemical signature of Council-approved cleaning compounds, mixed with the faint biological traces of 100 different species, all moving through the same corridors in the same routines, Day after day, year after year, it was the smell of a place where things happened slowly, deliberately, without urgency, because urgency implied that something might go wrong, and the council had built its entire civilization on the belief that things did not go wrong when properly administered. I had been inside Velrath for 11 days when I saw another human. That requires some context. Getting inside Velrath was not easy. The station was a bureaucratic hub, one of 7 in this sector, where species with complaints, petitions, trade applications, or legal disputes came to wait in long queues and fill out long forms and be told, eventually, that their case would be reviewed in the next cycle, which meant sometime in the next 2 to 5 years. The waiting rooms were full. The corridors were full. The council staff moved through it all with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of people who understood that they held every card in every game being played around them. To get inside, I had needed a new identity. The Valyrian contractor tag from the ironclad wake was not enough. Velrath ran council-grade biometric checks at every entry point. I had needed something better. It had taken me 3 days and more credit chips than I wanted to think about to obtain the identity of a colonial laborer from Meth Prime, a cold world in the outer sectors that had been absorbed into council administration 60 years ago and had spent the intervening decades in a state of sullen compliance. The people of Meth Prime were humanoid enough that council bioscanners, which were looking for broad biological categories rather than individual specifics, registered me as close enough to authentic. My hair was dyed brown. My eyes were fitted with gray-tinted lenses that slightly altered my iris pattern. My worker's permit said my name was Kara Wolf, Grade 3 Colonial Labor, specializing in atmospheric systems maintenance. I had left Lily with a contact I trusted, a Valyrian shipbroker named Sess who owed me a favor, and who had, on 3 separate occasions, hidden things from me without asking what they were. Sess would take care of Lily. Sess understood the value of careful silence. I had given Lily the second photograph I carried, not the one of my mother, but the one I kept for practical purposes. A small image of a park in London, somewhere green and ordinary and real, so she would have something to look at while she waited. The thing I was looking for inside Velrath was called the Purge Records. Every species in council space had stories about the Purge Records. They were supposed to be the official documentation of council enforcement actions, the detailed account of what the council actually did when a species was placed under a quarantine decree, not the public version, which used careful language about protective containment and species-level behavioral remediation, but the real version, the operational version, the one that listed the actual methods, the actual outcomes, the actual scale of what the council did to worlds that refused to cooperate. I needed those records, not for myself, though the things they contained were deeply personal in ways I tried not to think about too clearly. I needed them because they were evidence. They were the difference between a story that could be dismissed and a case that could not be ignored. The tribunal, the independent body of allied species that existed, technically, outside council authority, required evidence before it would act. I had been collecting pieces for years. The Purge Records were the piece that made all the other pieces matter. Finding them was the problem. On my 4th day inside Velrath, I was eating a poor imitation of food in a worker canteen on level 7, when a Vorathi sat down across from me. He was older, thin in the way that very old Vorathi become, with skin that had gone from gray to almost white, and eyes that were the pale yellow of something that had seen a great deal, and processed it all carefully. He had a data tablet in front of him and a cup of something that steamed faintly, and he said, without looking up from the tablet, "You are looking in the wrong places." I looked at him. "I am eating," I said. "You were in the administrative archive on level 12 this morning," he said. "You accessed the public index for the Tribunal Enforcement Division. You are not the first person to start there." He tapped something on his tablet. "The records you want are not in the administrative archive." My left hand, under the table, moved to the small tool I kept against my ribs. "Who are you?" I asked. "My name is Keith," he said. "I have worked as an archivist in this station for 22 years. I organize, catalog, and cross-reference everything that passes through this station's record system." He finally looked up at me. His pale yellow eyes were very calm. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "I have known since your first day here. Your biometrics are close to Meth Prime baseline but not exact. The variance pattern is consistent with human biology, overlaid with cosmetic adjustment. I noticed it when you entered. He paused. I chose not to report it. I kept my expression still. Why? Because, he said, settling back slightly. I have been an archivist here for 22 years. I have seen what passes through this station. I have catalogued things that I will not describe in a public canteen. And I have spent 22 years telling myself that an archivist's job is to record, not to judge. He looked at his cup. I am growing tired of that arrangement. His name was Keth. He was not an ally in any organized sense. He had no network, no resources, no plan. What he had was access. 22 years of access to a record system that most people assumed was impenetrable, because most people had not spent 22 years learning every corner of it the way you learn a building you have lived in for most of your adult life. He told me the purge records were stored in the tribunal vault, a sealed archive on level 4, accessible only through 3 separate authentication gates that required senior council credentials. He told me the authentication logs were reviewed weekly by a council security officer. He told me that a direct approach to the vault would flag an alert within 45 seconds of any unauthorized access attempt. That sounds like you are describing why this is impossible, I said. No, he said. I am describing the official pathway, which is impossible. There are other pathways. He finished his drink. I can show you the maintenance route behind Authentication Gate 2. The maintenance route does not exist in the official station schematic. I added it to the schematic myself, 6 years ago, while performing a records update, and I altered the entry in a way that erased it from the audit trail. He set the cup down. I have been waiting for a reason to tell someone about it. I studied him for a long moment. In my experience, people who offer help freely, and without obvious benefit, fall into 2 categories. The first category is people who are setting a trap. The second category is people who have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally found someone to help them put it down. Queth had the posture of the second kind, the particular exhaustion of someone who has known something wrong for years and has been looking for a way to make it right. You said I was not the first human to come looking, I said. What happened to the others? He was quiet for a moment. The first one came 8 years ago. A man. He called himself a journalist, which was not the word he used because that word has no direct translation in Council Common, but the concept was the same. He was here for 4 days. On the 5th day, he was gone. The station records showed he had departed on a registered transport. I later confirmed that no registered transport had departed on that date. He looked at me steadily. The second was a woman, 5 years ago. She reached level 4. She did not reach the vault. Another pause. I found a piece of her identification card in the recycling system 2 days after she disappeared. I kept it. I do not know why. I keep things. It is what archivists do. I sat with that for a moment. The canteen moved around us. Aliens eating their midday meals. Conversations in a dozen languages. The ordinary noise of a bureaucratic station grinding through another unremarkable day. The maintenance route, I said. How long would I have inside the vault once I reached it? 14 minutes before the automated sensor cycle resets. During the reset, the internal monitoring is offline. 14 minutes is enough, if you know exactly what you are looking for, and you have prepared your extraction method in advance. I would need a signal booster, something capable of copying 500 encrypted files in under 10 minutes. He reached into his jacket and set a small gray device on the table between us. I took this from the supply inventory 6 weeks ago, he said. I told myself I was auditing old equipment. The audit log has been updated accordingly. I looked at the device. I looked at him. You have been planning this, I said. I have been preparing, he said. There is a difference. Planning implies a specific outcome. I was simply making sure that when the right person arrived, I would be ready. He pushed the device slightly toward me. You are the right person. The night before I went into level 4, I sat in my assigned worker bunk and thought about Earth. This was something I did carefully and rarely, because thinking about Earth had a way of becoming dangerous. Not in the way that standing too close to a cliff edge is dangerous, but in the way that letting yourself feel too much in a situation that requires clear thinking is dangerous. Emotion is not weakness. I want to be clear about that. Emotion kept me going on nights when nothing else would have. But emotion without direction is just pain, and pain without direction is a distraction. So I thought about Earth deliberately and carefully. the way you might handle something fragile. I thought about specific things. The weight of real gravity, not the simulated gravity of ship systems, which is always slightly off in a way you feel in your ankles after a long day, but the actual, specific gravity of Earth, the way it felt to stand on a surface that had been pulling things toward its center for 4.5 billion years. I thought about the smell of rain on pavement. I thought about the particular quality of light on a clear morning, pale and gold and absolutely unlike the artificial lighting in any station or ship I had lived on for 10 years. I thought about a planet full of people who had spent 10 years under blockade, who had not left, who had not surrendered, who had apparently, at some point in the last 6 months, decided that the appropriate response to their situation was to broadcast jazz into the dark. I did not know who had sent that signal. I had only heard about it secondhand, from a contact 3 systems away who had picked it up on a wideband receiver. But I knew that someone on Earth, in whatever condition Earth was in after 10 years of isolation, had sat down at an instrument and played music and sent it out into space. Not a distress call, not a demand. Music. That was so human it made my chest ache in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. I went into Level 4 the following morning, through the maintenance route Keth had described, moving through a corridor so narrow I had to turn sideways in places, behind a wall that the station's official schematics did not acknowledge existed. The authentication gate was exactly where Keth had said it would be. The gap in the sensor cycle was exactly as long as he had promised. I was inside the vault in 11 minutes. The vault itself was cold and dim, which was to be expected for a sealed archive room, and it smelled like old storage, and the particular staleness of air that has not moved in a long time. The files were arranged in a system I had to learn on the spot, because the Council's internal filing logic was not something that translated easily into human organizational thinking. It took me 4 minutes to find the relevant directory. It took me 7 minutes to copy the files. While I was waiting for the transfer to complete, standing in that cold, dim room with the gray device Keth had given me, humming quietly in my hand, I glanced at the preview screen on the device and read the first 3 lines of the first document in the directory. I will not quote what they said. It is not because the words are too painful, though they are. It is because they were written in the clean, formal, impersonal language that bureaucracies use to describe things that should never be described in clean, formal, impersonal language. They used the word remediation 4 times in 3 lines. They used the word contained. They used the word resolved. My hands were perfectly steady. I have been asked about that by people who know what I read in that vault. They find it significant that my hands did not shake. I do not find it significant. My hands do not shake when I am angry. They go still. That is the thing about anger that has been carrying itself for 10 years. It does not tremble. It settles into you like ballast. It becomes the thing that keeps you level when everything else tips. The transfer completed. I pocketed the device. I left the vault the way I had come in. Queth was waiting at the end of the maintenance corridor, as agreed. I handed him back the signal booster, and he handed me a new travel document that had not existed that morning. He had spent the previous night carefully inserting it into the station's transit records, giving me a departure record for later that afternoon that would look entirely routine. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded, once, the nod of someone who knew they had done something that could not be undone, and had made their peace with it. "There is something else you should know," he said. "While you were inside, I was monitoring the council session log. The high session is in chambers today. They are discussing a preliminary assessment for a species called the Nurathi, a developing world in the 3rd sector. The language of the assessment matches the language in the first quarantine decree documents, the early language, before the decision was finalized." I looked at him. He looked at me. "They are going to do it again," I said. "The assessment will be concluded in 2 cycles," he said. "Perhaps 3. After that, the process moves quickly. Another world. Another species that did not know what was coming. Another deletion notice waiting to be written." I thought about this as I made my way back through the upper levels of Velrath, moving at the measured pace of a colonial worker heading to the end of a shift. Nothing notable. Nothing visible. The corridors were busy. A group of Nurathi delegates was actually here on the station, I realized. I had seen them on my 3rd day, a cluster of tall beings with bright, curious eyes who were waiting in the petition queue for a trade hearing. They were here to talk about trade, and 2 levels below them, the council was in session deciding whether their species would continue to exist. That was the thing about Velroth. That was the thing about the entire council apparatus. From the outside, from the level of trade hearings and petition queues and worker canteens and maintenance schedules, it looked like an enormous, boring, mostly functional bureaucracy doing the unremarkable work of administering a large number of species across a large amount of space. And underneath that surface, in sealed chambers and classified archives, and deletion notices processed without ceremony, it was something else entirely. I left Velroth that afternoon on a registered transport. My travel document was perfect. My biometrics passed without a flag. I sat in a window seat and watched the station shrink as we pulled away. An enormous structure that looked, from the outside, like order, like stability, like something that knew what it was doing. The files were on the device in my jacket pocket. The files that said remediation and contained and resolved, that described in clean language what had been done to Earth and the people on it, and the millions who had been outside the system when the blockade went up and had found themselves suddenly stateless, suddenly invisible, suddenly erased from every legal record that said they were real. I had what I had come for. Now I needed to get it to the people who could use it. I pressed my forehead against the cold of the window and watched the stars and thought about where to go next. I had a narrow-band transmission code memorized, a code I had been given 3 years ago by a man who had smiled when he gave it to me and said, "When you are ready, when you have enough, send this. We will find you." I thought I was ready now. I thought I had enough. The stars moved outside the window. Velroth disappeared into the dark, and somewhere out there, in the deep places between systems, in the dead zones and the blind spots and the silent corners where council sensors could not reach, something was waiting. I was going to find it. The transmission code had 7 segments. I had memorized them the way my instructors at the academy used to tell us to memorize emergency protocols, not by writing them down, not by saving them to a device, but by repeating them until they lived behind your eyes, until they were part of the furniture of your mind, accessible without thought. A 7-segment code means a 7-step routing process. Each step bounces the signal through a different relay point, each relay point in a system outside council sensor range. The whole chain takes 48 hours to complete, which means whoever built the system valued undetectability more than speed. That told me something. I sent the code from a public communications terminal, in a transit station, 3 systems away from Velroth, using a credit token I had bought from a vending machine, with cash so old it had probably changed hands 40 times. I did not sign the message. The code itself was the signature. I bought a meal I barely tasted, found a seat in the terminal's general waiting area, and sat very still, in the way I have learned to sit still in public places. Not motionless, because motionless draws attention, but contained, settled, like someone waiting for a connection, rather than someone waiting for the most important response of their life. The reply came 39 hours later. It was not a text message. It was a set of coordinates, nothing else, delivered to the same public terminal in a routine traffic bulletin that no one would think to read twice. The coordinates pointed to a region of space that most navigational charts described as a debris field left over from a stellar collision several centuries ago. Pilots avoided it. Council patrol routes went around it. It was, in navigational terms, a place worth nothing, which made it, in practical terms, exactly what you needed. Getting there took 11 days and 3 ship changes. I will not describe those 11 days in detail, because they were the kind of days that exist primarily to be endured. Cold bunks on cheap transports, eating from vending units, reading old data on a device that was almost out of charge, thinking carefully about what I was doing and whether it was the right thing, and concluding each time that it was the only thing. Lily was safe with Cess. The files were on the device in my boot, because my boot had proven itself a reliable storage location over the years. I was moving toward coordinates I had never visited, given to me by people I had not spoken to in 3 years, to find something that was either real or the most carefully maintained piece of hope I had ever been foolish enough to follow. On the 11th day, my transport entered the debris field. The pilot, an elderly Keth who had been flying these outer routes for 30 years, and had the particular stoic quality of someone who has stopped expecting things to be interesting, ran an automated debris avoidance sweep and settled into a slow transit path through the outer edge of the field. From the window, The debris looked like what it was, the broken remnants of something very large that had ceased to exist a long time ago. Rock and metal, some of it enormous, most of it drifting in patterns that looked almost random, but were governed by the same slow gravitational logic that governed everything in space. Dark and cold and silent. I was the only passenger who had booked a stop inside the field. The pilot had not questioned this. He had simply adjusted his route and charged me extra for the deviation. When we reached the coordinates, there was nothing there. I stared out the window at a patch of debris, indistinguishable from any other patch of debris in the field, and I thought, very briefly, that I had made a serious mistake, that the code had been old, that the people who gave it to me had moved on. That 3 years was a long time, and ships full of survivors do not stay in one place for 3 years when Council patrols are looking for them. Then the debris moved. Not all of it. A specific section, perhaps 200 meters to the left of the transport's current position. A cluster of large rock fragments shifted their relative positions by small degrees, the way objects shift when something large has moved past them, displacing the gravitational balance, like a hand moving under a blanket. The transport's proximity alarm sounded. The pilot swore in Keth and grabbed his controls, and then the ship appeared. She did not simply appear, the way ships appear in stories, one moment absent, the next present. She appeared the way something very large appears when it has been very carefully not appearing, which is slowly, in sections, like a puzzle assembling itself in reverse. First the drive signature, which the transport sensors registered as a sudden and impossible power reading where there had been nothing a moment before. Then the hull, which I recognized was covered in some kind of surface coating that mimicked the reflective properties of the debris around it. Not invisibility exactly, but the next best thing. Then the full shape, resolving out of the dark and the rock and the stellar debris like a memory you had stopped believing in. She was large, not enormous by fleet standards, but large, a mid-class destroyer, the kind that Unsk had been building in the years before the blockade, designed for long-range operations, deep space deployment, the kind of missions where you would not be resupplied for months at a time. She had been modified. The hull was patched in at least 30 places I could see from the window, each patch a slightly different shade of gray, the accumulated repair work of years without a dry dock. She carried no markings, no flag, no identification codes, nothing that would tell a Council scanner what she was, but the design was unmistakably human. The name was still on her bow, scratched, worn, maintained by hand rather than by automated systems, but still visible, Revenant. The transport pilot was now experiencing the special kind of alarm that comes from having a military-grade destroyer materialize in a debris field where his navigational charts had assured him nothing large existed. He was also receiving a hailing signal, which I could see on his communication board, a short-burst transmission on a frequency that the Revenant should not technically have been able to broadcast without appearing on Council sensor nets. "Take the hail," I said. He looked at me with wide, flat Keth eyes. "Please," I said, "take the hail. And then I am going to need a transit pod." The Revenant's transit bay was smaller than I remembered from my Unski service years, but that was because I was used to the enormous transit bays of fully crewed fleet vessels, and the Revenant's transit bay had been converted into secondary storage on one side and what appeared to be a small workshop on the other. Everything aboard the ship had the same quality as the hull patches, maintained, adapted, repurposed, kept functional by people who had learned to be creative about what functional meant. The officer who met me in the transit bay was Lieutenant Diane Okafor, who had been, before the blockade, a communications specialist on the Unsieski vessel Meridian. She was now something harder to classify. The Revenant did not seem to operate on a strict rank structure, or if it did, the structure had adapted into something more practical than formal. She shook my hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes moved over me with the quick, practiced assessment of someone who has spent years deciding very fast whether to trust people. "Commander Voss," she said, "we were not sure you were still alive." "I was not entirely sure either," I said, "some days more than others." She walked me through 3 corridors to the bridge. The corridors were narrow and lit with the slightly warmer lighting that I knew came from human-preferred spectrum bulbs. The Revenant's crew had replaced the standard ship lighting with something that felt more like sunlight. Small thing, important thing. After years of the blue-white light of Council and Keth and Valurian ships, The warm yellow of those corridors hit something in me that I had not realized was still capable of being hit. The bridge was crewed by 14 people, 12 humans, one Vorathi named Kess who had been with the ship for 4 years, and a young Keth woman named Rella who had joined the crew 6 months ago after her cargo company had been seized by Council authority, and she had found herself with no ship and no legal standing in any port. They all looked at me as I came in. I looked back at them, human faces, tired and watchful and alive. At the center of the bridge, standing at the main navigation table with a coffee cup in one hand and a data chip in the other, was Admiral Tomas Reyes. He was older. Of course he was older. We were all older. But the change in him was specific, not just the lines in his face or the gray that had come into his hair, but something in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his stillness. He had the look of someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had made peace with the carrying, but had not put the thing down. He was 61 years old. He had been the commanding officer of Earth's last functioning deep space fleet when the blockade went up. He had been in the outer system on a training exercise when the Council sealed Earth's perimeter. He had not been able to get back. I knew this. I had thought about it, from time to time, in the way you think about the specific sorrows of specific people you respect. He looked at me. Something moved in his face. Not sentiment exactly. Reyes was not a sentimental man, in the way that people who have to make very hard decisions in very short time frames tend to have the sentimentality trained out of them. But something. "Voss," he said. "Admiral," I said. We did not hug. We shook hands, the grip of two people who had both learned to express things through their handshakes that they had also learned not to say out loud. Then he set down his coffee and his data chip and said, "Tell me what you have." I told him. I told him about the deletion notice, about Lily in the container, about Velrath and Keth, and the maintenance corridor, and the 14 minutes in the vault. I told him about the files. I gave him the device from my boot. He handed it to Lieutenant Okafor without looking away from me, and she took it to a console and began the file transfer while we talked. He told me about the Revenant. He told me about the last 10 years in the way that someone tells you about a decade when they have had to compress it into something that can be understood. Not every day, not every loss, but the shape of it. The first year, when they had still believed the blockade would be temporary, that the Council would reconsider, that some diplomatic solution would emerge from the chaos. The second year, when they had stopped believing that and had started building something else instead. The slow accumulation of allies, alien species who had been on the wrong side of Council authority, who had their own reasons for wanting a different arrangement in the galaxy. The network of hidden supply chains, black market contacts, quiet sympathizers in Council-adjacent systems who had seen enough to know that what was happening to Earth was not justice, regardless of how the Council chose to present it. "We have 11 confirmed Council vulnerability points," he said, moving to the navigation table and pulling up a star chart. 11 places in their patrol structure, their supply chain, their communication network, where a targeted action could cause significant disruption. We have mapped them over the course of 6 years. We have the allies to act on them. What we have not had, until now, is the evidence that changes the political calculation. He looked at the file transfer on Okafor's console. "The purge records," he said. "If the tribunal sees those files," I said, "they cannot ignore it. The preliminary material I gave them 2 years ago was not enough. They cited insufficient documentation. The complete records change that." "Yes," he said, "they do." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Earth is still there, Voss. I want you to know that before anything else. Still broadcasting, still holding. We intercepted a transmission 6 months ago. Someone playing music, live, wideband. We spent 3 weeks trying to figure out where the signal was originating, whether it was a distress marker, whether it had strategic implications." He paused. "It was a jazz recording. Someone put a microphone next to a speaker and broadcast it. No message, no code, just the music." I did not say anything for a moment. I looked at the star chart on the navigation table, at the small yellow indicator dot that represented Earth's position, a dot that existed on the Revenant's charts because the Revenant had not deleted it. "Who is still down there?" I asked. "We estimate between 2 and 3 billion, he said. "Based on the last reliable population data and adjusted for 10 years of siege conditions, He said this with the flat steadiness of someone who has said a terrible number many times until it stopped breaking him every time, and has also understood that not being broken by it is a practical necessity rather than an absence of feeling. The blockade limits communication. We get fragments. Enough to know that the surface is organized, that they have maintained infrastructure in the interior regions, that the coastal areas are harder. They are growing food. They are maintaining power in most regions. They are not giving up. 3 billion people, on a planet the Council had decided to erase from the navigational charts, playing jazz in the dark. I have something else for you, I said. I told him about the Narathi. About the Council session Keth had flagged. The preliminary assessment language that matched the early quarantine decree documents. The delegates who were waiting upstairs in the petition queue for a trade hearing, while the decision about their species was being made 2 floors below them. Reyes absorbed this. He was very good at absorbing difficult information without showing the weight of it in his face. Timeline? He said. Queth said 2 or 3 cycles. 4 months. Perhaps 5. Then we have 4 months, he said. And the tribunal hearing will need to happen inside that window, because if the Council acts on the Narathi assessment, the tribunal loses the argument that this is historical rather than ongoing. The records alone are not enough to convene a hearing. We need a living example. We need the Narathi delegates to understand what the assessment means and to stand with us. They are still on Velroth, I said, waiting for their trade hearing. Then someone needs to talk to them, he said. And then we need to get the purge records to the tribunal before the Council realizes we have them. He picked up his coffee cup again, took a measured sip, and looked at the star chart. What is your status? How long do you need before you are operational? I thought about 11 days on cold transports. I thought about a photograph in my boot, and a child I had left with a Valurian shipbroker, and 10 years of being very tired in ways that sleep did not fully address. How long can you give me? I asked. 48 hours, he said. Then, 48 hours, I said. He almost smiled. It was a small movement, the kind you only catch if you know what you are looking for. I knew you would find us eventually, he said. I always thought it would be Voss who got here first. You have always navigated by something the charts don't record. What is that? I asked. He looked at the yellow dot on the star chart. Stubbornness, he said. The absolute refusal to accept that the coordinates are blank. I went to the bunk they assigned me. The mattress was thin, and the pillow smelled like the recycled air of a ship that had been closed for a long time, and the lighting above me was that warm yellow that was not quite like sunlight, but was close enough that it reminded me of something, and I lay on my back and stared up at it for a while. Then I slept. I slept for 14 hours, which was more sleep than I had managed in a single stretch in probably 2 years. And when I woke up, the ship was moving, and the crew was busy, and someone had left a cup of something warm outside my door that tasted, improbably, something like coffee. I held the cup in both hands and stood in the corridor of a ship full of humans who had been living in the dark for 10 years and had built something extraordinary in it, and I thought that 48 hours was not much time, but it was enough. It would have to be enough. We were very good at doing things with not enough time, not enough resources, not enough of anything except the particular determination that comes from having everything else taken away. The Revenant moved through the debris field, quiet and dark and present. The galaxy did not know it was there. That was exactly the point. The briefing took place in the Revenant's smallest conference room, which had previously been a storage closet and still had hook mounts on 2 of the walls where shelving used to hang. 6 people around a table. Me, Reyes, Lieutenant Okafor, a man named Gus Hartley who had been the Revenant's tactical officer for 7 years, and had the kind of contained, precise manner that very good tactical minds tend to develop. A Vorathi named Kess, who handled alien communications and liaison work, and a young human woman named Petra North who was, without question, the most quietly terrifying person I had met in recent years. Petra was 26. She had grown up on a council-adjacent station after her family had been outside Earth's system when the blockade went up. She had spent her teenage years learning things that children should not have to learn, and she had turned those things into skills, and she had arrived at the Revenant 4 years ago with 2 false identities, a set of abilities that made Gus Hartley look at her with something between admiration and professional concern, and an absolute refusal to discuss her past in any detail. The mission Reyes laid out was straightforward in structure and extremely dangerous in practice. We needed to return to Velroth. We needed to locate the Narathi delegation and have a conversation with them that would fundamentally alter their understanding of why they were there and what was about to happen to their species. And we needed to do all of this without alerting the Council security apparatus, which maintained a significant presence on the station. The Narathi delegates are housed in the Petition residence block on level 9, Okafor said, pulling up the station schematic on the table's display. Standard accommodation for species awaiting trade hearings. Council security makes routine passes through the residence block twice in every shift cycle. The gaps between passes are 22 minutes. Long enough for a conversation, Gus said. Not long enough for a conversation that changes someone's worldview. We are not changing their worldview in the residence block, I said. We are giving them information and a location. The conversation happens later, somewhere the Council cannot monitor. We have a relay point at the edge of the system, Kess said. His voice was the particular low, resonant quality of older Varathi, measured and precise. Outside Council sensor range. If the Narathi can access a transport, we can have the real conversation there. The problem was getting to the Narathi in the first place. After my previous visit to Velroth, the risk profile for any of us entering the station directly was elevated. The Meth Prime identity I had used was burned. I had left no obvious trail, but Keth had confirmed that Council security had run a general biometric sweep of the station in the days following my departure, which suggested they knew someone had been inside the vault, even if they did not know who. Standard Council response. Widen the net, increase the checks. 4-person team, Reyes said. Voss leads. Hartley north. Kess. The rest of us stay with the ship. I need to be there, I said. The Narathi need to see a human face. They need to understand that we are real, that we have survived, that the extinction the Council implied for us did not happen. That is the message that makes them listen. Reyes looked at me with the expression of a man who understood exactly what I was saying and was calculating the risk of it simultaneously. Agreed, he said. But you go in with a different identity. Petra, what do we have? Petra had been quiet through the briefing, which was normal for her. She kept a small tablet on the table in front of her and had been making notes in a shorthand I could not read. I have a Darathi shipping coordinator identity I built 2 months ago, she said. Full biometric package, employment record, travel history. The bioscan deviation from human baseline is within the acceptable margin for Darathi-adjacent humanoid species. She paused. There is also an active Darathi shipping inspection scheduled at Velroth starting in 4 days. If we time arrival to coincide with the beginning of that inspection window, the entry scan will be processing a high volume of Darathi-adjacent credentials and running at reduced individual check time. Everyone looked at her. I have been building contingencies, she said, without expression. We went in with 4. Me under the Darathi shipping coordinator identity, Gus as my freight assistant, Petra, operating independently, under her own cover, Kess moving through the station's Varathi administrative channels, using credentials that were, as far as anyone could determine, completely genuine. Kess had spent a lot of years carefully building himself genuine credentials. He was very good at it. The entry scan was as Petra had predicted. Busy, slightly rushed, the particular energy of a security system running at higher than comfortable capacity. My biometrics cleared in 31 seconds. Gus cleared in 28. I had expected to feel something coming back through Velroth's entry gate, some heightened alertness, some physical reaction to being back in a place where I had taken significant risks. What I actually felt was familiar. The station smelled the same. The bureaucratic hum of it was the same. I had been in enough of these places, long enough, that they had stopped feeling threatening in their surfaces. The threat was always underneath. The Narathi residence block was on level 9, as Okafor had said. We reached it during the 22-minute window between security passes, moving through a corridor that led, ostensibly, toward the freight coordination offices on the same level. There were 3 Narathi delegates in the block. We needed to speak to at least one. The one we found was a young male, standing in the corridor outside the residence rooms, with the restless, slightly lost quality of someone who has been waiting in an unfamiliar place for a long time and has run out of comfortable things to do with the waiting. He was tall, as all Narathi seemed to be, with the bright, curious eyes that I had noticed on the ones I had seen during my previous visit. He was holding a data tablet and looking at it without really reading it. I approached him directly, which is always the bolder move and is also often the safer one, because people who are doing something they should not be doing tend to approach obliquely, and an oblique approach in a monitored corridor is more notable than a direct one. "Delegate," I said, in council common. "My name is not important. What I am about to tell you is." He looked at me. He looked at Gus beside me. His bright eyes moved between us, with the quick intelligence of a species that had not survived long enough to develop interstellar travel by being slow on the uptake. "You are human," he said. His voice was soft and slightly surprised. "I thought humans were extinct." "We are working on correcting that impression," I said. "You are here for a trade hearing. The council accepted your application, which means you are waiting for them to review your world's eligibility for a standard trade agreement. Is that correct?" "Yes," he said, cautiously. "I need you to look something up for me," I said. "In the council's public archive, accessible from any station terminal, there is a historical record of species that have been placed under quarantine decrees. Search the record and look for the language in the preliminary assessment phase. The language that appears in the weeks and months before the decree is formally issued." He was watching me with an expression I recognized. The expression of someone whose certainty about their situation is beginning to shift slightly, like a plate on a table that has been nudged and is still spinning but might stop at a different angle than expected. "Then," I said, "compare that language to whatever documentation you received from the council regarding the preliminary review of your trade application." I paused. "Compare it, word by word." His eyes went very still. This is a thing that happens to very intelligent beings when they receive a piece of information that rearranges several things they thought they knew. The eyes go still while the mind does very fast work behind them. "We received a preliminary review document 4 weeks ago," he said. It used very specific language. It said the Council's Harmonization Committee was conducting a standard cross-referencing assessment of our world's social stability indicators. "Look up the assessment language," I said, "and then meet me at a relay point outside this system." I gave him the coordinates. "Come in. A private transport. Tell no one who gave you the coordinates." I took a step back. "I am sorry," I added. "I am sorry that this is the conversation you are having in a corridor on a bureaucratic station, instead of the trade hearing you came here for. I am sorry that the galaxy works this way." He looked at me for a long moment. "Are you really human?" he said. "Yes," I said. "And you are still alive?" "After everything the council said." "We are still alive," I said. "Barely, with considerable effort. That is what I am trying to help you avoid." I moved away. Gus fell in beside me. We took the corridor toward the freight coordination offices, moving at the unhurried pace of people whose business here was unremarkable. Behind us, I heard the soft sound of the delegates' footsteps going toward the nearest station terminal. The next part of the mission was not in the plan. The plan had been, contact the Narathi, leave the station, return to the Revenant, prepare for the tribunal. The plan was a good plan. The plan did not account for the fact that when Petra checked in via the short-range comm she wore behind her ear, she said, very quietly, "We have a problem. Level 4. Now, there are several ways to move quickly through a station like Velroth, without appearing to move quickly. The best one is to move at exactly the pace of someone who has a legitimate reason to be going somewhere slightly faster than normal. A freight deadline, a schedule conflict, the specific urgent but not alarming energy of someone running a few minutes behind. Gus and I covered the distance from level 9 to level 4 in 6 minutes. Petra was waiting at the stairwell exit. Her expression was the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and found it unpleasant. "Velkath is here," she said. The name landed in my stomach. Velkath was a council inquisitor, one of 7, currently active, who served as the investigative arm of the council's enforcement division. Inquisitors were not security officers. They were not patrol agents. They were the people the council sent when it believed something had gone wrong and wanted to understand exactly how wrong and who was responsible. Velkath, specifically, was the inquisitor who had signed the original quarantine decree for Earth. His name appeared in the first line of the first document in the Purge records. He had been the administrative architect of what was done to my world. I had known he existed. I had studied his file. in the way you study the files of people whose decisions have structured your life, with the particular cold attention of someone who needs to understand an adversary, rather than process an emotion. He was 70 years old. He had served the council for 40 of those years. He had a reputation for a very specific kind of intelligence, the kind that does not miss details. "Where is he?" I asked. "He arrived this morning on a council priority transport," Petra said. "He has taken a meeting room on level 4, and he is currently interviewing station security staff. The questions he is asking are about the archive access incident from your last visit, 3 weeks. It had taken the council 3 weeks to send an inquisitor to investigate a vault breach. That was faster than I had expected. Can we get out?" I asked. "Not through the main entry," Petra said. "He has put a biometric hold on outgoing traffic from Velrath's primary departure docks. It is not a full lockdown. He does not want to alarm anyone yet. But every departure is being processed through an additional check." "Freight dock," Gus said. "Cargo transports run a different departure process. He would need to extend the hold specifically to the freight side, and he would need more authority clearance than a single inquisitor has." 14-minute window, Petra said. "Freight departure cycle. The next one is in 20 minutes. "Then we move now," I said. "Kess?" "Already at the freight dock," came Kess's voice through the comm. We moved. The route took us through the administrative levels where the corridor density was highest. More people meant more cover, more ambient noise, more legitimate foot traffic to blend into. The freight dock was on the station's lower ring, accessible via a service elevator that required a freight coordinator code. I had one. So did Gus. We were 3 corridors from the service elevator when I saw Velkath. He was walking toward us from the opposite end of the corridor, accompanied by 2 council security officers and a station administrator who was talking very quickly and looking very uncomfortable. Velkath himself was tall, even for his species, which I did not know. His file had not specified, and the images in it had been formal portraits that gave no scale. He was wearing council formal attire, dark and clean-lined. His face was composed with the absolute neutrality of someone who has spent a long career being impossible to read. His eyes met mine. I kept walking at the same pace. This is the most important thing in that kind of moment, the pace. The pace tells your body how to behave, and your body tells your face, and your face tells anyone watching whether you are someone with something to hide. I was a freight coordinator running a few minutes behind schedule. I had been a freight coordinator all day. I would continue to be a freight coordinator for the next 400 meters. Velkath's eyes moved to Gus. They moved back to me. He stopped walking. The administrator kept talking. The security officers looked at their superior with the slight uncertainty of people whose boss has done something they did not anticipate. Velkath raised one hand, a small gesture, and the administrator went silent. We were 6 meters away from him. 5, 4. He looked at me with the particular attention of someone who has made a career of noticing things other people miss, and I looked back at him with the complete calm of someone who has made a career of not being noticed, and we passed each other at 3 meters, with the Velrath corridor traffic moving around us like water, and I felt his eyes on the back of my head for every step after we passed, and I did not turn around, and I did not change my pace, and I did not, despite every instinct I had developed over 10 years of staying alive in hostile environments, reach for anything in any of my hidden pockets. We reached the service elevator. The freight dock was exactly where it was supposed to be. Kess was exactly where he said he would be. The departure cycle was running. We were on the cargo transport and moving within 12 minutes. In the cargo transport, sitting in the small passenger compartment that smelled of machine oil and the packaging material of 100 different types of freight, I thought about the moment in the corridor, about Velkath stopping, about his eyes on the back of my head. He had seen me. I was certain of it. Not identified me, not flagged me. His security officers had not moved. The corridor had not locked. We had not been stopped. But he had looked at me with the attention of a man who trusts his instincts, and his instincts had told him something. I thought about this for a long time. I thought about whether what I had done in the corridor had been the right thing, and whether there had been another option. I concluded there had not. And then I thought about something else. The Nurathi delegate would access the archive tonight. He would read the language. He would compare it to the documents his world had received. And then he would make a decision. The way all sentient beings make decisions, when the reality of their situation becomes clear. He would either accept the situation or he would not. I believed he would not accept it. I believed this because I had looked at his bright, curious eyes in that level 9 corridor, and I had seen something I recognized. Not defiance, not yet, but the early shape of it. The moment when a being begins to understand that what they were told was not the same as what is true. There was one more thing I was certain of. I had let Velkath see me, not by accident, deliberately, in the fraction of a second in which I had the choice, because an inquisitor who had seen a face but could not name it, who had felt the particular wrongness of a detail he could not yet articulate, was an inquisitor who would spend the next days and weeks and months thinking about what he had almost recognized. And a man like that, thinking about what he had almost recognized, would eventually put the name to the face. And when he did, he would know that a human woman had walked through his investigation at arm's length and kept walking. He would know that a species he had decided to erase from the maps was still out here, still moving, still very much present. I wanted him to know that. I had made a decision, and I stood by it. The worst thing you can do to people who want you gone is to be visible. Not loud, not reckless, not threatening, just present, just real, just there when you are supposed to be nowhere. The cargo transport moved through Velroth's traffic lanes and out into open space, and I sat in the small compartment smelling of machine oil, and I was quietly, precisely, thoroughly satisfied with the day. We had what we needed. We had the contact we needed, and somewhere on a station behind us, an inquisitor was standing in a corridor, thinking about a woman he could not quite place. Good. Let him think. The Galactic Tribunal met in a station called the Orvith Platform, which existed in a political sense that was almost philosophical. It belonged to no single species, was administered by a rotating council of 7 independent systems, and occupied a region of space that the major powers had agreed, 200 years ago, to treat as neutral ground. The agreement was honored not because any of the major powers believed deeply in the principle of it, but because each of them had, at various points in those 200 years, needed the tribunal for something. That is the practical foundation of most institutional neutrality in the galaxy. Not idealism, mutual need. I had never been inside the Orvith platform before. Very few humans had. The tribunal was not a place humans had needed. Historically, for most of our time as a space-capable species, we had been developing, expanding, figuring out the shape of this galaxy and our place in it, too busy with the work of becoming to spend much time in formal grievance chambers. I looked at the outside of the platform from the Revenant's docking approach, and I thought about how strange it was to be bringing a case to a body that represented the most formal expression of galactic civilization's commitment to something like justice, when that same civilization had spent the last 10 years erasing us from its maps. The gap between what civilizations say and what they do is always large. I had just spent a long time on the wrong side of it. The delegation from the Revenant was small by necessity. Reyes, Okafor, Kess, and me. Petra stayed with the ship. Gus stayed with the ship. 52 other crew members stayed with the ship, which was positioned in the neutral zone, at a distance that was technically within the tribunal's jurisdiction, but practically very difficult for the council to act against, without formally violating the same neutrality agreement they had relied on 14 years ago, when they had brought a boundary dispute to the tribunal floor. The Narathi delegate had come. I saw him when we entered the tribunal's waiting chamber, standing near the far wall with 2 of his colleagues, all 3 of them still wearing the travel clothes of people who had moved quickly, and were not sure they had made the right decision yet. His name, I had learned through Kess, was Orith. He had been a diplomat for 6 years. He had a family at home on his world. He had, on the night after our corridor conversation, spent 4 hours at a terminal in the Velrath archive, reading the documents I had told him to read, and then he had spent the following night in his residence room not sleeping. He had then told his colleagues what he had found, and the 3 of them had taken a private transport to the relay point outside the system, and Kess had met them there and brought them here. He saw me when I came in. His bright eyes carried the particular expression of a person who has recently gone through the process of learning that the world is significantly different from what they had been told, and has come through the other side not broken but changed, harder, in the specific way that knowledge hardens people, more awake. "You came," I said. "I compared the documents," he said. His voice was very controlled. "Word by word, as you said." He paused. The language is identical. Not similar. Identical. The same phrases. The same structural approach. The same euphemisms for the same processes. He looked at me steadily. What are the processes? He asked. The ones hidden underneath the language. I told him. Not everything. Not the most detailed contents of the purge records, because those were for the tribunal floor, presented in proper sequence, with proper documentation. But enough. The outlines of it. The kind of remediation the council had applied to Earth when the political decision was made. He listened without interrupting. His two colleagues listened beside him. No one said anything for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "How many on your world survived?" "Approximately 3 billion, I said. "Of an original population of roughly 9 billion. The number settled in the room like a stone dropping into still water. He breathed in through his nose, slow and deliberate, the deliberate breath of someone managing a strong response. "What do you need from us?" he said. "Your testimony," I said. "Your presence on the floor, when we present the records. The tribunal needs to understand that this is not historical. That the pattern we are documenting is ongoing. That another species is currently in the preliminary assessment phase." I held his gaze. "Your testimony transforms a historical grievance into an immediate one. It changes the tribunal's calculus completely." "And if the council retaliates," he said. "They will try to," I said. "But the tribunal's neutral zone protection, combined with the public record of your testimony, makes direct retaliation politically expensive, in a way it was not with Earth. Silencing a species quietly is a different matter from acting against a species that has just stood on a tribunal floor in front of 17 allied observers." I paused. "I am not telling you there is no risk. There is risk. I would be insulting your intelligence to pretend otherwise. What I can tell you is that the risk of speaking is lower than the risk of not speaking. If you return to Velroth and wait for your trade hearing, the assessment process will proceed. You will not know when the decision is made. You will not know what comes next until it is already happening." He looked at his colleagues. A moment passed between them, wordless. The kind of communication that happens between people who have been through a significant experience together and have developed a shorthand for their conclusions. "We will testify," he said. The tribunal convened the following morning. The chamber was large in the way that spaces built for formal deliberation tend to be. High ceilings, arranged seating for the 17-member species, a central floor where speakers stood. The sound system was good. The translation system was better. Near simultaneous rendering into every major language, which was one of the few genuinely impressive pieces of technology I had ever seen the tribunal possess. The council's representative was a senior administrator named Veth Paloris, which I knew because his name and credentials had been included in the tribunal's speaker manifest. He was a small, precise being in council formal attire, with the composed, confident manner of someone who has spent a career representing an authority that does not expect to be challenged. He had arrived with 4 staff members and a legal data package that I assumed contained the council's prepared response to whatever case we brought. He did not look alarmed when he saw me enter the chamber. He looked faintly curious. The way you look at something unexpected that you are confident is not a real problem. I was the first speaker. I had asked for this. Reyes had offered to speak first, as commanding officer, but I had explained my reasoning. The tribunal needed to see a human face telling a human story. Reyes was remarkable in many ways, but he had the bearing of a military officer, and military officers giving formal testimony in civilian chambers tend to land in a way that foregrounds the military before the person. I did not want the tribunal thinking about soldiers. I wanted them thinking about people. I stood on the tribunal floor and I said, "My name is Sarah Voss. I was born in Bristol, England, on the planet Earth, in the Sol system. That system, as of approximately 3 weeks ago, no longer exists in the Council's official navigational database. It was removed without notice, without legal process, and without the knowledge of the 3 billion human beings currently living on that planet. I am here today because what was done to Earth, and what is currently being planned for another species in this chamber, requires a response from this body. And I am here in particular because someone needs to stand in this room and demonstrate, in the clearest possible way, that the species the Council told you was effectively gone is in fact not gone at all. I had their attention, all 17 member species. The tribunal chairs, 3 senior arbiters, were watching me with the careful, non-reactive assessment of people who have heard many things in that chamber and have learned to reserve their response. But they were listening. Really listening. I presented the purge records. Okafor ran the file display from a console at the side of the floor, and the documentation appeared on the chamber's main screens. Not all of it, because there were thousands of files, but the key documents, the ones that named processes and dates and scales of action, the ones that used the words remediation and contained and resolved to describe things that had killed billions, the ones that showed, in the Council's own formal language and internal records, the gap between what they said and what they did. Paloris, the Council's representative, rose twice to challenge procedural authenticity. Both times, I addressed the challenge directly. The files bore the Council's own encryption signatures, unbroken, unmodified, exactly as they existed in the vault on Velrath. We had not altered a single character. We had only copied. Every challenge Paloris raised, the internal metadata of the documents answered. After the records, Orith testified. He stood on the floor of the tribunal, and he described, in his controlled, careful diplomat's voice, the language of the preliminary assessment document his world had received. He read the relevant passages aloud. Then he read, from the historical record, the identical passages from Earth's preliminary assessment, 22 years ago. He did not editorialize. He did not need to. The 17 member species in that chamber heard 2 texts with the same words, in the same order, and they understood what that meant without anyone explaining it. Paloris rose again. He said the preliminary assessment of the Narathi was a routine harmonization committee procedure with no predetermined outcome. He said the purge records, while authentic, should be understood within the historical context of a species, meaning us, that had presented significant cross-cultural instability and required containment measures for the safety of broader galactic civilization. He used careful language. He used the kind of language that bureaucracies develop for exactly this kind of moment. Language designed to acknowledge the surface of something while draining it of its meaning. I had been expecting this. I had prepared for this. The Council's representative has just used the phrase, containment measures, I said, when it was my turn to speak again. In the purge records, the same phrase appears in Document 7 of the Enforcement Directive series. It is defined, in that document, in operational terms. I nodded to Okafor. The screen changed. The definition appeared. The tribunal is invited to read that definition and consider whether the phrase containment measures, in the Council's own operational language, means what the representative appears to believe it means. The chamber read. The chamber was quiet. Then I did something I had thought about very carefully for a long time, and had decided to do because I believed it was the most powerful thing available to me in that room, and also because it was true. I talked about Earth. Not the legal case, not the documentation. I talked about the specifics of what I knew, not from records but from living it, and from the fragments that had reached us over 10 years. The people who had built underground food systems to survive a decade of reduced surface access. The schools that had kept running in repurposed buildings. The broadcast I had heard about. Jazz, playing into the dark. Not a distress signal, not a demand, just music, sent into space by someone who believed, against every reasonable calculation, that someone out there was still listening. I talked about Lily, the child in the container with the cargo tag on her collar, who had looked at me with large eyes and asked if humans were still alive. The Council's position, I said, is that what was done to Earth was a response to human aggression and cross-cultural instability. What I am telling this tribunal is that what was done to Earth was done to people. Specific, individual, complicated, musical, stubborn, very much alive people. 3 billion of them are still there. They have been sending signals into space for 10 years. They have not asked us to avenge them. They are not asking for rescue in the way that implies helplessness. They are asking to be acknowledged. They are asking someone with the authority to say so to say, on the record, that they exist. I paused. The chamber was very quiet. And the Narathi, who came to this station in good faith to discuss trade, deserve to know that the process currently being applied to them is not a harmonization committee review. They deserve to know what the language means. They deserve the chance to stand in this room, rather than to look up one day and find that their coordinates have been removed from a map. The tribunal deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours is fast, by tribunal standards. It usually takes days. The result was not a verdict. The tribunal does not issue verdicts. It issues findings and recommendations, which carry the political and diplomatic weight of the 17-member species collective endorsement, which is significant weight in every system that is not directly controlled by the Council. The finding was this: the purge records were authentic, and their contents represented a matter of galactic civil concern. The quarantine decree imposed on Earth was found to have been executed in a manner inconsistent with the humanitarian standards the Council publicly endorsed. The preliminary assessment process applied to the Narathi was formally flagged for independent review, and the final line of the finding, the species identified as human, resident primarily in the Sol system, is recognized by this tribunal as a legal entity with full standing before this body. Paloris stood up when the finding was read. He said, with the composed certainty of someone who represents an authority that does not believe it can be checked, "The Council does not recognize this finding as binding. The Council maintains its position on all matters relating to the Sol system and to Council quarantine authority. This tribunal's finding has no operational consequence." He gathered his data package. He gestured to his staff. He turned toward the exit with the confident bearing of someone who is leaving rather than retreating. Reyes opened the comm channel. I had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment was this one. Paloris, walking toward the exit, the Council's representative performing the posture of an authority that cannot be touched. Reyes's voice came through the chamber's speaker system, calm and clear. "Platform Orvith, this is Admiral Tomas Reyes, of the unsquid vessel Revenant. We are currently in the tribunal's neutral zone, at coordinates on file with the platform authority, and we will be remaining at those coordinates for the time being. We thought the tribunal, and any other interested parties, should know we are here." The screen at the front of the chamber showed the Revenant's position, fed from the platform's external sensor array. She was there. She was large. She was very visible. Paloris stopped walking. I looked at the Council's representative from across the tribunal chamber floor, and I felt the particular satisfaction of a thing clicking into place. Not triumph, not yet, because there was a great deal of difficult work still ahead, but the satisfaction of a moment in which an argument has been made in the clearest possible way. The argument was not the words I had spoken, though those mattered. The argument was the existence of the Revenant at those coordinates. The argument was 300 humans who had spent 10 years in the dark, building something the Council had decided could not exist. The argument was that we were here. We had always been here. We would continue to be here. Paloris looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said something to his staff in a low voice. Then they left the chamber. Not the confident exit of before. Something different now. A recalculation. The leaving of someone who has gone into a room expecting one thing and discovered that the room contained something else entirely. Oreth came to stand beside me as the chamber began to empty. "What happens next?" he asked quietly. "The Council will respond," I said. "They will not accept this quietly, but they will have to think carefully about how they respond, because the finding is now on record. The records are now in the public domain, and whatever they do next, 17 species are watching." He nodded, slowly. "And Earth?" I looked at the screen where the Revenant's position was marked in the neutral zone. I looked at the dot that was not Earth, but was the direction of Earth. "We go home," I said. "That comes next." It was the first time I had said those words out loud in 10 years. They felt exactly the way I had hoped they would feel. Not like a dream, not like a wish, but like the next item on a list, specific and achievable, and already in progress. We go home. Next. The Council's fleet arrived in the Tribunal's neutral zone 47 hours after the Tribunal's finding was read. 47 ships. I was on the Revenant's bridge when the sensor sweep caught the first drive signatures, and I watched the numbers climb as the scope resolved each vessel: 12 patrol cruisers, 18 destroyer class, 9 heavy response units, and 8 support craft carrying the specific sensor and communications equipment that the Council used for enforcement blockades. The formation was clean and deliberate, the kind of formation you put together when you want the message to be clear before a word is spoken. The message was, "We do not accept what happened in that chamber, and we are here to demonstrate what our acceptance is worth." Reyes stood at the navigation table with his arms crossed and a coffee cup he was not drinking. He looked at the scope display for a long time. Nobody spoke. The bridge had the particular quality of quiet that experienced crews develop in serious moments. Not tense silence, because tension costs focus, but the compressed, contained silence of people who are doing their jobs very well. 47, said Gus Hartley, from his tactical position. Yes, said Reyes. We have one, said Gus. Yes, said Reyes. He took a sip of his coffee. We do. The thing I need to explain, because I understand that the math of it seems impossible, is that the advantage was not really ours, in numbers or in firepower. The Revenant was a mid-class destroyer. She was well maintained, in the specific way that things maintained by people who have no replacement parts and must be creative, become extraordinarily well maintained. But she was one ship. The Council had sent 47. In a direct engagement on open terms, that was not a fight. That was an ending. But the engagement was not going to happen on open terms. It was never going to happen on open terms. The Council had built its military doctrine around overwhelming force presented decisively, the assumption that showing enough strength removes the need to use it. It is a very effective doctrine against species that can be overwhelmed. Against a species that has spent 10 years learning to operate in the spaces where overwhelming force cannot follow, it has a fundamental weakness. The weakness is that it requires a clear target. Diane Okafor had spent the previous 47 hours doing something very specific. While the rest of us had been dealing with the aftermath of the tribunal hearing, managing communication with the allied species representatives, coordinating with Orith and the Nurathi delegates, Okafor had been working at her console with the focused intensity of a person who finds deep satisfaction in complex signal architecture. What she built was elegant. I am not a communications specialist, and I understood only the broad mechanics of it, but the results were clear. She had found a way to broadcast Earth's blank coordinates. The null space where Earth's navigational entry had been, the deletion notice I had intercepted on the ironclad Wake weeks ago, was still circulating in Council navigational update systems. Every Council-registered ship received it automatically. The blank coordinates were, in a sense, already inside every Council vessel's navigation computer. Okafor had found a way to weaponize that fact. The broadcast she sent used the Council's own navigational update frequency, the same channel that had carried the deletion notice, to transmit the blank coordinates as an active ghost signal. To a ship's navigation computer, the signal read as a moving object at the blank coordinates, something large, something with a drive signature, something that the computer needed to flag and track. The computers flagged it. The computers attempted to track it. The computers routed targeting solutions to it. And the targeting solutions found nothing, because there was nothing there. And they looped, and attempted again, and found nothing. And the computers, which were very good computers, very expensive, very thoroughly tested on every predictable problem, and therefore very bad at the specific unpredictable problem of a targeting loop that the system itself had generated, began queuing alerts for sensor malfunction. On 47 ships simultaneously, every automated targeting system, every sensor sweep aimed at the Revenant, suddenly had a competing signal to process. The 47 ships were not blinded, they could still see, but their weapons systems and their targeting computers were, for the first 90 seconds, occupied with trying to understand why their own data was contradicting itself. 90 seconds is a long time. The Revenant moved. I want to be clear that what Reyes did in those 90 seconds was not reckless. I have heard it described that way by people who were not there, who look at the numbers and conclude that charging a 47-ship fleet in a single vessel is a thing that only desperation or madness could produce. It was neither. It was the result of 6 years of careful observation, of studying every Council patrol engagement, every enforcement action, every formation report that had come through channels the Council did not know we were monitoring, of understanding not just the firepower of each class of Council vessel, but the doctrine that governed how they used that firepower. It was the result of knowing things about how the Council fought, that the Council assumed no one outside its own command structure knew. The heavy response units, the 9 largest ships in the Council formation, were positioned at the outer ring of the formation, because heavy response units are not designed to move quickly, and because they are at their most effective when they can bring their full weapons range to bear on a single position. They needed space to use their firepower, without hitting the ships around them. This meant there were gaps. Not large gaps. But the Revenant was not a large ship, and the gaps were navigatable by someone who had spent 10 years navigating in places where the margin for error was the difference between surviving and not. Reyes took the Revenant through the gap between the 4th and 5th heavy response units with 41 meters of clearance on each side. The Allied ships, 3 vessels from the Tribunal's allied species who had joined our position in the neutral zone after the finding was announced, moved to the outer flanks simultaneously, not engaging, just present, just visible, just adding to the complexity of a tactical picture that the Council fleet's computers were already struggling to process. The battle was not a battle in the cinematic sense. There were no dramatic ship-to-ship exchanges, no spectacular hull breaches visible through porthole windows. It was tactical, and precise, and very fast, and most of it happened on screens, and in data systems, rather than in visible space. What I can describe is what I saw from the bridge. I saw Reyes standing at the navigation table, very still, calling course adjustments in a quiet voice to the helmsman, a young man named Owen Drake who had grown up on the Revenant, and who was 22 years old, and flew a destroyer through a 47-ship fleet formation, with the focused, almost serene concentration of someone doing a thing they were made to do. I saw Gus Hartley at tactical, making precise, targeted decisions rather than broad ones, not firing at ships, but at specific systems on specific ships, the sensor arrays and communication relays that the formation needed to coordinate. Disrupt the coordination and the formation becomes 47 individual ships rather than a unified force. 47 individual ships, uncertain of their targeting, uncertain of their communications, uncertain of where exactly the threat was. That was a different problem from 47 coordinated ships bearing down on a single target. I saw Kess on the communications board, broadcasting in real time to every frequency the allied species operated on. Not tactical information, but something else. The Tribunal's finding, the text of it, on loop. In every language the Council's allied and subject species used. Not propaganda, the actual document, the actual words, the actual legal finding of the body that the Council itself had used 14 years ago when it needed to resolve a boundary dispute. And I saw the navigational display, where the ghost signal from Okafor's broadcast moved in loops through the Council fleet's sensor picture. A blank where a planet's coordinates should have been, turned into a weapon by the Council's own erasure. They had removed Earth's name from the map. They had left the shape of the space behind. Okafor had simply filled that shape with light. The first Council ship withdrew 11 minutes into the engagement. She was a patrol cruiser on the outer ring, and her commander made the decision that when your targeting system is giving you looping alerts, and your communication with the fleet command ship is interrupted, and you cannot confirm the position of the vessel you are supposed to be engaging, the correct thing to do is to pull back to a confirmed safe position and request a tactical assessment. It was a reasonable, professionally sound decision. The second withdrawal came 4 minutes later, then 2 more together. The Council formation was not breaking. It was recalibrating, pulling back into a tighter defensive arrangement. But the pullback itself was significant. The Revenant drove into the space they left, and Owen Drake took us through the gap between the retreating cruisers and the heavy response units with the kind of precision that made Gus Hartley, at the tactical board, exhale quietly in what was either relief or admiration or both. The flagship was a large vessel, the command ship for the entire formation, positioned at the center of the arrangement in the way that command ships position themselves, protected by the formation around them, away from the immediate engagement. On its bridge, I understood without being there, a Council fleet commander was receiving real-time status updates that were telling him things he had not expected to be told, that his targeting systems were compromised, that 3 allied species vessels were on his flanks, that the Tribunal's finding was being broadcast across every frequency his fleet could receive, that a single human vessel was inside his formation rather than being destroyed by it, and that, on the Orvith platform behind him, the Tribunal's arbiters were watching every move, and the record was being made. The flagship's drive signature changed, not the signature of an attacking vessel, but the signature of one that is repositioning, moving from the center of the formation toward its rear, a large ship moving carefully through its own fleet. Reyes watched this on the scope. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, quietly, to no one in particular. There it is. It was not a retreat in the full sense. The fleet did not disperse, did not scatter, did not turn and run. But the flagship moved to the rear, and when the flagship moves to the rear of its own formation, it is communicating something to every other ship in that formation. It is communicating that the engagement profile has changed, that the calculation has been updated, that the commander is no longer certain of the outcome. The full withdrawal came 22 minutes later, clean, organized, coordinated. The Council fleet pulled back from the neutral zone in formation, maintaining their structure, maintaining their dignity, moving not like a force that had been defeated, but like a force that had decided the terms of this engagement were not the terms it had come here for, and would need to be reconsidered, which is, in practical terms, not different from being defeated. But it sounds different, and in these matters, the sound of it matters to the people doing the withdrawing. The last ship crossed out of the neutral zone. The scope showed clear space. The Revenant's sensors went from active to passive, from combat mode to observation mode, and the specific hum of the ship in full tactical operation settled down into something quieter. And then someone on the bridge laughed. It started with Owen Drake, still at the helm, who put both hands flat on his console and laughed with the surprised, uncontrolled quality of someone releasing something that had been very tightly held. Then Gus, at tactical, a short bark that he immediately attempted to suppress and failed. Then 3 other crew members in quick succession, the particular laughter of people who have just survived something they were not entirely certain they would survive, and who are only now, in the first seconds of the aftermath, allowing themselves to know how uncertain it had been. Reyes watched the scope. He did not laugh. He stood very still for a moment, and then he set his coffee cup down and said, "Good work. All of it. Every single one of you." He said it simply, without ceremony, and it landed the way simple, true things land. I was standing at a secondary console near the back of the bridge. I had not had a specific function in the engagement. I was not tactical. I was not helm. I was not communications. I had been there as an observer, as the person who understood the political context of what was happening, as the person who, if things had gone badly, would have been the one to think about what to do next. I had watched the whole of it from that position, and now I stood in the quiet aftermath of it, in the warm yellow light of the Revenant's bridge, surrounded by the sound of my people breathing and laughing and existing. I thought about Velkath, the Inquisitor, who would receive a report about this engagement. I thought about what that report would say. A Council fleet, 47 ships, had withdrawn from a neutral zone engagement with a single vessel. The vessel was human. The vessel was the ghost ship that had been rumored for years and never confirmed, the Revenant. It was confirmed now. It existed now, on record, in the open, named and real. The Council had tried to erase us, had tried to make the coordinates blank, to make the entry in the database absent, to make a whole world a gap in a numbering sequence. And we had turned their own erasure into a ghost signal and driven it through their fleet formation. I thought about how that would read in Velkath's report. I thought about the Inquisitor in the Velroth corridor, the moment when his eyes had met mine, and something in him had registered an anomaly. I thought about him processing the anomaly now, fitting the face from the corridor into the context of everything that had happened since, understanding finally who he had almost recognized. I hoped the understanding was uncomfortable. I hoped it was the specific discomfort of a person who is very good at predicting things and has miscalculated significantly. I went to find Reyes. He was in his small office adjacent to the bridge, looking at the communication board, which was showing incoming transmissions from the Allied species vessels and from the Tribunal platform. I stood in the doorway for a moment. "They will come back," he said, without turning around. "Not with that fleet. Not in that configuration. Not to this location. But they will respond. We need to be moving before they decide how." "Earth," I said. He turned. "Earth," he said. In the hours that followed, the Revenant received 3 separate communication requests from Allied species, who had watched the engagement from their own sensor platforms. 2 wanted tactical briefings. 1 wanted to discuss the establishment of a formal mutual defense arrangement, which was a thing that 3 weeks ago would have seemed like the beginning of a very long and uncertain negotiation, but which now, in the context of a tribunal finding and a Council fleet withdrawal, seemed like a conversation that might actually go somewhere. We answered all three. Reyes handled the defense arrangement request with the careful precision of someone who understood what they were building and did not want to build it carelessly. Okafor handled the tactical briefings. I sat in the small conference room that was a closet and thought about coordinates. Earth's coordinates, the ones that were blank in the Council database and present in ours, because the Revenant had never deleted them, had kept them the way you keep the address of home even when you cannot go there. There was still the blockade. The Council's physical barrier around Earth's system was not the fleet that had just withdrawn from the neutral zone. It was a separate, long-standing force, smaller, but entrenched, supported by relay stations and monitoring buoys that had been in place for 10 years. Getting through the blockade was not the same problem as the one we had just solved. It was a more difficult problem in some ways, and a simpler one in others. More difficult, because the blockade force had 10 years of positional knowledge of Earth's system. They knew the approach vectors, the gravity wells, the orbital mechanics. They had spent a decade learning the shape of the space they were guarding. Simpler, because the space they were guarding was the space we were from, and we knew it too. I looked at the coordinates in the navigation system. The yellow dot, the sun, the third planet. We go home, I had said on the tribunal floor. Next. It was next now. I went back to the bridge and stood beside Reyes at the navigation table, and I said, "Give me the blockade deployment data. Everything we have on their current formation." He nodded to Okafor, who transferred the files to my station. I looked at the data for a long time. I looked at patrol patterns and relay station positions, and the orbital geography of a system I knew the way most people know the street they grew up on. "I know a way in," I said. Reyes looked at me. "The night-side approach to the third planet," I said. "There is a gap in the relay station network on the far side of the system. It has always been there. The Council positioned their stations based on the standard approach vectors, because standard approach vectors are where you expect traffic. But the gap exists because there is a gravitational anomaly on the night-side approach that their survey data flags as a navigational hazard." I pulled up the relevant data. "It is only a hazard if you do not know the specific drift pattern of the anomaly and account for it in your approach calculation." "And you know the drift pattern," Reyes said. "I grew up 2 kilometers from the Bristol Channel," I said. "My father taught me to navigate tidal currents before I could drive a car. I know the drift pattern." Reyes looked at the navigation display for a long time. Outside, through the viewport, the stars were the ordinary, unremarkable stars of neutral space, none of them particularly meaningful in themselves, all of them points on a map that someone had tried to blank out and failed. "Then plot the course," he said. I sat down at the navigation console. I pulled up the chart. I found the yellow dot, Earth's sun, warm and ordinary, and exactly where it had always been. I began to calculate. The night-side approach to Earth took 9 days. 9 days of moving through the system's outer edges at low drive output, using the gravitational drift of the anomaly I had described to Reyes, a slow, deep oscillation in the gravitational field caused by the particular arrangement of the outer planets, the kind of thing that automated survey instruments flag as a hazard, and experienced navigators learn to use as cover. It was not a comfortable 9 days. The Revenant moved slowly, which felt wrong in a vessel designed for speed, and the crew was quiet, with the particular intensity of people who are very close to something they have wanted for a very long time, and are trying not to want it too openly, because wanting things openly before they are certain makes the loss of them worse. Owen Drake flew us in centimeter by centimeter, metaphorically speaking. He and I traded watches at the navigation console, him for 12 hours, me for 12 hours, each of us running continuous drift calculations and adjusting heading by fractions of degrees. We did not speak much during those watches. We did not need to. The work was precise, and the focus required was total, and we were both too close to the thing we were doing to want to talk about it. On the 3rd day in the system, I picked up a signal. It was faint, and I almost missed it. It was not on any standard communication frequency, not on anything the Revenant's automated systems were configured to flag. I found it because I was manually scanning the broad spectrum, the way my father had taught me to scan for maritime radio signals off the coast, moving slowly through the bands, listening for anything in the noise that was not noise. And there it was. A low-frequency carrier wave. Very simple, very old-fashioned in its construction, The kind of signal you build when you are working with equipment that has been repaired so many times, the original specifications are a memory. Music. I sat at the console for a moment with my headset on, listening. It was a piano piece, live. Someone playing it now or in the last few hours. The playing slightly imperfect in the way that live music is always slightly imperfect, with the small variations of breath and timing that recordings flatten out. I did not know the piece. I knew the instrument. I knew the feeling of it. The clean, specific sound of 88 strings, struck by small hammers, in the order that someone had decided made meaning. I sat, and I listened to it for a long time. Then I took off the headset, and I told Reyes. He came to the console and put the headset on, and listened for almost 5 minutes. When he took it off, he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Put it through the bridge speakers. I want everyone to hear it." So for the remaining hours of that watch, while Owen Drake made his careful adjustments, and the Revenant crept through the system's night-side approach on minimal drive output, the sound of someone playing piano on Earth came through the bridge speakers. The crew worked to it. They did not stop working. There was too much to do, too much to monitor, too many variables to track in a slow night-side transit of a heavily monitored system. But they worked to the sound of it, and the quality of the silence between those of them who were not working, who were listening with whatever part of their attention was not occupied, was different from the silence of before. The blockade perimeter was at 300,000 kilometers from Earth's surface. 12 ships in a pattern that had been established in the early days of the blockade, and had been incrementally reinforced over the years. Additional ships added after the first year. Additional relay stations added after the third. The formation was dense at the standard approach vectors from the inner system, and lighter at the outer approach, because the Council's navigational threat assessment model treated the outer system as low risk for breach attempts. Deep space was harder to transit safely, and the outer approaches were slower. They had never had to deal with someone who knew the drift pattern, and had 9 days. We came out of the night-side approach at a point in the perimeter where 3 blockade ships covered a large sector. Their sensor overlap was calculated for standard speed transits. A slow transit at minimal drive output, hugging the gravitational drift of the anomaly all the way to the perimeter edge, would register to their automated systems as a small debris signature until we were close enough that close did not matter anymore. Reyes made the call at 15,000 kilometers from the perimeter edge. He broadcast on the Council blockade frequency, open and clear, the Revenant's identification, our position, and our intent to proceed. He said, "This is Admiral Tomas Reyes, of Unsk Revenant. We are in the Sol system. We are proceeding to Earth. We are doing this in the open, under observation, on the record. We invite you to note the position of the vessel, the time, and the fact that we are a single ship, with no aggressive formation, and no active weapons. Any action taken against us will be fully documented and transmitted to the Tribunal platform, and to every allied species communication network in this sector." He put the channel on hold and looked at me. Now we see what they do. The 12 blockade ships went active immediately, drive signatures flaring, sensor sweeps intensifying, the unmistakable electronic shift of vessels going from patrol status to response status. 2 of them began repositioning, moving to intercept angles that would put them across our approach path in approximately 40 minutes. Then something happened that I had not expected. One of the 12 blockade ships sent a signal, not on the Council military frequency, on the same broad-spectrum carrier that the piano music had come through, the old simple construction, the channel Earth's people had been using to send signals into space for years. The signal said, in English, "We see you." 3 words, "We see you." The people on Earth had been monitoring the system. They had been watching the blockade for 10 years, tracking ship positions, and sensor sweeps, and communication patterns, learning everything they could learn about the people who had sealed their sky. And they had been watching us come in. 3 words, sent in the language of a species that the Council had erased from the navigational database, transmitted on a frequency the Council's automated systems would not flag, because it was too old and too simple to appear in the threat catalog. "We see you." Reyes looked at me. I looked at him. Then he turned back to the communications board and said, "Owen, take us in." The 40-minute intercept window that the 2 repositioning blockade ships represented was not a guarantee of engagement. It was a possibility, which was different. The Revenant accelerated on the Earth approach vector, and as she accelerated the broadcast went out. Okafor had prepared it, and was running it on every frequency simultaneously. A package that included the Tribunal's finding, the Purge Records reference summary, and a direct statement that the Unsk Revenant was proceeding to Earth in accordance with the Tribunal's recognition of humanity's legal standing. The two intercepting ships slowed. I watched their drive signatures on the scope. They slowed. Then they stopped their repositioning, hovering at the angles they had reached, maintaining their current positions rather than completing the intercept approach. Not standing down. They were still active, still watching, still in response posture, but not moving to intercept either. 47 hours earlier, those same two ships had been part of a fleet that withdrew from the neutral zone. Their commanders were receiving news from their fleet command about the Tribunal finding. They were receiving news about what had happened in the neutral zone. They were receiving news about broadcast records that were now in the public domain of 17 allied species, and they were watching a single human vessel on an approach to Earth, broadcasting those records on open frequency. The intercept did not complete. We passed through the blockade perimeter at 243,000 kilometers from Earth's surface, with 2 blockade ships holding position and 10 others maintaining their patrol patterns. Not cleared, not authorized, not welcomed, but not stopped. The difference, on that particular day, in those particular circumstances, was enough. The atmosphere was ahead of us. I moved to stand beside Owen at the helm, because I needed to see it from the front. Earth was in the viewport. I need to describe this carefully, because I want to be accurate and not sentimental, and it is difficult to be accurate about the moment you see your home planet for the first time in 10 years, without sentiment getting into the way. It was blue and white, which you know from images, from descriptions, from every piece of media that has ever depicted a view of Earth from space. But the images do not convey the specific quality of blue. It is a particular blue, a depth of it, the color of water at significant depth viewed from above, and the white of the clouds moves across it in patterns that are never exactly the same twice. And the whole thing is lit by a star that is exactly the right distance away, and exactly the right type to produce a light that the human visual system was, in the most literal evolutionary sense, designed to find correct. It looked right. After 10 years of lights that were almost right, and air that was almost right, and gravity that was almost right, it looked right, in a way I had no language for, except that the part of me that was built for this specific planet recognized it, without needing to be told what it was. Beautiful, Owen Drake said quietly. He had been born on the Revenant. He had never seen it before. We entered the atmosphere on the night side of the planet, which I had planned not for tactical reasons but for the reason that approaching at night meant coming in over a dark surface lit only by what the people below had kept lit. Cities, some of them still running on whatever power systems had survived and been maintained, communication towers, broadcasting into space, the occasional moving light of a vehicle on a surface route, and in the gaps, the dark areas where infrastructure had not held, the small scattered lights of individual fires and lanterns, and the particular human impulse to put a light in the dark, even when the dark is very large. We found a large flat area about 50 kilometers from the center of what had been a major population zone. The geography was familiar. The central region, the interior plains that had become the primary settled area as coastal infrastructure had become more difficult to maintain. We landed. The landing gear made contact with actual soil, with actual rock, with the specific surface of a world that had been pulling things toward it for 4.5 billion years. The gravity was right. It was right in my ankles. It was right in my shoulders. It was right in the way that nothing aboard any ship or station had been right for 10 years. They came from several directions. I had not expected them so fast. But they had been watching the approach. They had been watching everything. The blockade ships and the sensor sweeps, and the transit through the perimeter. And when the Revenant landed, they knew exactly where she was. And they came from several directions at once. Not running, most of them, the particular pace of people who are trying to be measured, but cannot quite contain the urgency underneath. People in a range of conditions, well-clothed, poorly clothed, thin, tired, some of them clearly unwell in ways that spoke to a decade of difficult circumstances, but walking, alive, moving toward a ship that had come through their sealed sky. A woman reached us first. She was perhaps 50 years old, gray-haired, wearing practical clothing, of the kind that had been repaired so many times the original fabric was mostly a structural suggestion. She stopped a few meters from the landing ramp and looked at Reyes, who had come down the ramp ahead of me. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said simply, "You are late." Reyes looked at her. Something moved in his face that he did not conceal, for once, and did not try to. "I know," he said. "I am sorry." She looked at him for another moment. Then she stepped forward and put both arms around him, the embrace of someone who has survived something long and difficult, and is finally in a position to release some of the weight of it onto another person who can bear a share of it. He put his arms around her. They stood like that for a while. Behind her, the people were arriving. Dozens, then 100, then more, coming from the directions I had seen when we landed. The crew of the Revenant came down the landing ramp in ones and twos, and met the people of Earth in ones and twos, and there were faces I cannot describe because description reduces them to types, and they were not types, they were people, each one entirely specific, each one carrying a particular decade of a particular life, on a particular world, that had kept going past every reasonable expectation. Owen Drake came down the ramp and stepped onto Earth for the first time, and stopped, and stood very still. Someone nearby saw his face, the expression of a person experiencing something they have no reference point for, and walked over to him, and said something quiet. He nodded, slowly, and then they walked together a little way from the ship and he crouched down and put both hands flat on the ground. I watched this from the ramp. I had not stepped off yet. I took the photograph out of my boot. It was worn and soft and the fold lines were deep. It was my mother, in the park in London, sometime before everything, squinting slightly into bright ordinary sunlight. I looked at it for a moment, then I folded it back into its worn creases and put it in my jacket pocket, where I could feel its weight against my chest. I stepped off the ramp. The ground was uneven here, rough grass and packed earth, and it pushed back against my feet in the specific way of things that have not been maintained for organized use, but have continued to exist perfectly well regardless. The sky above me was dark and full of stars, and the blockade ships were up there somewhere, and the tribunal platform was somewhere beyond them, and the council was somewhere beyond that, still processing, still recalculating, still deciding what the events of the last several weeks meant for their careful, administered, map-based understanding of the galaxy. I let them process. I was thinking about something closer. The smell of rain on actual Earth, not approximated, not recycled, not the ghost of it caught in the recycled air of a ship that had been trying its best. The real thing, the actual smell of actual soil and actual grass on an actual night on the one specific planet I was from. I stood in it for a while. I did not count the minutes. In the weeks that followed, the work was enormous and unfinished, and would remain unfinished for years. The blockade did not end because a single ship came through it. It ended, gradually, incompletely, in stages over the following months, as the Council underwent the specific kind of internal fracture that large institutions undergo when the weight of an exposed wrong becomes heavier than the weight of admitting it. Velkath was the first, the Inquisitor who had signed the quarantine decree, and had stood in a corridor on Velrath and looked at my face without quite recognizing it. He released a statement, 3 weeks after the Revenant's landing, acknowledging that the tribunal's finding was legitimate, and that the processes applied to Earth had exceeded the documented authorization for quarantine enforcement. He did not apologize, because bureaucrats of his type do not apologize. He acknowledged. The distinction mattered to him. It mattered less to me. Other acknowledgments followed, slow, administrative, delivered in the language of legal process rather than human language, but real in the way that changes to official records are real, the kind of real that can be pointed at, cited, built upon. Earth's coordinates were restored to the navigational database 61 days after the landing. I was told about it by Okafor, who had set up an automated monitor on the Council's navigational update frequency. She sent me a message, one line. It said, "They put us back." I read the message 3 times. Then I sat for a moment in the particular room I had been given in the settlement community outside the former city center, a room with a window that faced east, and I thought about the deletion notice I had intercepted on the ironclad wake, and about the small gap in the numbering sequence that a system update had left, where Earth's entry had been, a gap so small that most automated systems would never catch it. Someone had caught it. I had caught it. I thought about what I wanted to feel in that moment, and found that the feeling was not what I had expected. Not triumph, though the word comes to mind first. Not relief, though relief was present. The feeling was something quieter and more durable. The feeling you get when a thing that needed to be done has been done, and the work that needs to come next is already in view, and you are tired in the way that comes from having done something real, rather than the hollow tired of waiting. We were back on the map. We had never needed the map, but the map was a record, and records are what civilizations use to tell themselves what they are, and a civilization that recorded us as absent had been lying to itself in a way that needed correcting. The correction was made. The record was changed. 3 billion people who had lived for 10 years in the gap in that numbering sequence were now, officially, in the database of the galaxy that had tried to pretend they were not there. I went to the window and looked out at the morning, which was coming up in the east in the specific way of mornings on Earth, a particular progression of light that goes from nothing to gray, to the pale gold of early sun rising over a horizon that is the exact right distance away. I had the photograph in my jacket pocket. I left it there. Somewhere in the settlement, someone was playing music. Piano, again. It seemed there was more than one. The sound came through my window, mixed with birdsong, mixed with the voices of people starting their day, mixed with the particular living noise of a place that was still here. It was cold. The kind of autumn cold that is not hostile but is direct. The cold of a planet doing its seasonal business without reference to whether anyone finds it convenient. I had been cold in space for 10 years, in ways that were managed, recycled, approximated. This cold was its own thing entirely. I liked it. There was a great deal of work ahead, reconstruction and negotiation, and the long, complicated business of a species rejoining a galactic community that had tried to exclude it, on terms that would take years to fully establish, and would require the kind of patience that does not come naturally to people who have spent a decade surviving on urgency. There were conversations to have with the Nirathi and with the other allied species and with the Council's remaining administration about what a different arrangement might look like. There were people to find, scattered across Council space, who did not yet know the blockade was ending. There was Lily, who was still with Cess, and who I needed to bring home. There was everything. I was grateful for it, all of it. The enormity of the work ahead felt, that morning, not like a burden but like proof. Proof that we were still here in sufficient numbers and sufficient condition to have enormous work to do. Proof that the deletion notice had been wrong about us in every way that mattered. I had been a navigator for most of my adult life. I knew how to hold a heading through a long approach. I knew how to adjust for drift. I knew how to find the specific star in a field of 1,000 stars that was the one you were looking for, and I knew how to plot a course toward it, and keep plotting it, even when the journey was long, and the light at the destination was faint. We were home. The music came through the window. The light came over the eastern hills. The cold was real, and the ground was real, and the sky above me, wide and pale and brightening, was the exact sky I had been born under, and had carried in my memory for 10 years, like a photograph folded soft at the creases. We were back on the map. We had never